Is a dynamic artist, educator, and curator who we've had the pleasure of working with here at the conservatory a couple of times. We're really excited for her Black History Month presentation tonight titled Mercy, Mercy Me, How African Americans Address the Environment. I will go ahead and turn it over to Juarez, and afterwards we'll take a couple of questions from you guys.
All right, thank you, Ty. Good evening, everybody. How is everybody? Good to hear. I have a background in teaching at the college level. I've taught from itty-bitties all the way to college level. And one of the things I often deal with is how to deal with a room of like face teenagers and how to engage them. So you all seem to have a little, am I coming in and out? Or is it the way I'm standing? Okay. Or do I need to talk louder? I felt like I was kind of like on a cell phone with a bad connection. Check. Well, I can hold the microphone too. You know, that'll make it a lot easier, I think. That way I don't have to like dance around the stand and stuff. I like to move a lot more anyway. So to my students in the house, happy shout out, happy shout out. We just finished a wonderful Print Life program. But anyway, back to talking about a room full of impassive faces. So one thing that I like to use is a little humor. If I can make you laugh, then I know I got you a little bit. I can get a smile, tease a chuckle out of you. That's a good thing. And then also too, since we have some energetic youngsters in the house, I want to kind of use a lead-in. You can go to the next slide, please. Just as a lead-in to my talk, you know, we'll give something that maybe the shorties can bounce around to. I know that I'm aging myself with this because I was a shorty when this came out. But some of you might remember it, so, you know, even if you don't want nobody to know your age, you can kind of bob your head along. Whoa, mercy, mercy me. Whoa, things ain't what they used to be, no, no. Where did all the blue skies go? Poison is the wind that blows from the north and south and east. Oh, mercy, mercy me. All things ain't what they used to be, oh no. Oil wasted on the ocean and upon our seas, fish full of mercury. And you all know the rest of it, okay? So what I want to point out, thank you. Now y'all wait. But also too, I wanted to point out that, you know, back in the 70s, and I know I'm dating myself a little bit, we used to talk about the environment. We called it the ecology, and there were little programs that, you know, this idea of going green and conserving and recycling really is nothing new, though it's getting a resurgence now. But the very idea that Marvin Gaye did an entire album. Okay, I know some of you, I'm predating myself once again. Before streaming services, we used to put music on these little black things called records, and we play them on these record players. And so an album would have maybe like about 10 songs or so. But anyway, Marvin Gaye was really like a modern opera about issues of the environment. So even this song, some of y'all might have did your little step-a-set to it back in the day, but you can see from the lyrics up here that he's talking about some really serious issues. It was really kind of prescient, a bit ahead of its time, some of the things that he's speaking about, not just in this particular jam, but also throughout the album. Next slide, please. So in talking about African American artists and addressing the environment, I'm going to give you like a little tasting menu, like I always tell people in lectures. If you see someone that interests you, feel free to take a screenshot or give that artist a Google. You may want to learn more about them in a little more in depth. I certainly can't cover everything in my brief little bit of time. But in dealing with the environment, we see artists that deal with it in different ways. Some like to paint the landscape. Some people deal directly with the land, different interventions. Some people deal with it in a political manner. So we're going to see some different slices of how this goes. Next slide. So we'll take it back to the days here. Among the earliest African-American painters were landscape artists. And the kind of cool thing is that one, a lot of times they were able to travel. In the case of this artist, he traveled from Washington, D.C., to Sacramento, to British Columbia, back to Tacoma and Portland, to Montana, and finally settling in Minnesota. So he had a lot of mobility. Think about the time frame we're talking here, 1887. So we're not too far removed from the Civil War. An interesting note about Grafton Tyler Brown. One, you can see he's really phenomenal landscape painter. And oftentimes these guys were able to make a living for themselves doing engravings or doing like commissions. I might do your house or something like that. So in all these different places, by the time he was 24, he was actually able to set up a little print shop. He inherited a print shop from a guy that he worked for and took over it. So this idea of African Americans, not only as artists, but as entrepreneurs, actually making a little bit of a hustle for themselves. And interesting thing about Brown is that when he moved to British Columbia, he started passing. And so the census records for him pulls him a little lighter and a little lighter. He goes from being black to color to mulatto to eventually to become white. And it's really, say, hey. Well, in the sense that, in a way, it might have been a yay for him because that allowed him more professional opportunities. In British Columbia, he was really well known. He was a bit of a star. And sad to say, just a sad state of affairs, he might not have been able to reach that level of prominence had he not passed. So I'm not here to judge those particular choices, but I do enjoy his work. There's a really marvelous range of work. Because of his travels, he's able to see all these wonderful landscapes and vistas and things like that that the average person wouldn't have gotten to see during this time frame, let alone the average African American. Next slide, please. Another artist of his ilk, and another one that's really well known, is Robert S. Duncanson. Now, Duncanson was able to travel not only across the United States, but he traveled to Europe. It was not uncommon for artists at this time, you know, those who had a little bit more money, of course, to make what we call the grand tour. So they made their way to Europe and studied in some of the great schools of Rome and Paris and places like that. When you hear about artists like Henry Ossawa Tanner, he was one of those artists that made that kind of tour. So Duncanson did too. He made his way through Canada and Europe and so on. And so oftentimes, this is not only fueling their skills, being able to travel and study at some of these great academies, but also being able to look at beautiful landscapes. It's like the American landscape wasn't just the province of European painters who came into America. African Americans were just as interested. We were just as interested in westward expansion and documenting that, and then just celebrating God's great landscape. This particular style of painting, you may have heard of a term Hudson River School. And what that deals with is a style of landscape painting where the sky is like prominent. You know, most of what you see, if we were to slice this painting up, you have a little bit of foreground and some teeny weeny people, but then after that you've got trees and sky. And most of the vibe of the Hudson River School was to showcase this idea that God and nature were supreme. Little bitty people are up in the forefront and they're saying, well, we're just little bitty ants on this grand sphere of godliness and goodness. So if you look at, you know, both Moore Duncanson and other painters of that Hudson River School, you see these really big skies in the landscape where the people, if they're people at all, are kind of reduced to like this sort of miniature. But again, really amazing stuff. And then Duncanson was oftentimes assigned to do murals. So if you had money, you can get him to paint one of those beautiful landscapes in your parlor. And so they're uncovering a lot of these now that have been covered with wallpaper and things like that. Next slide, please. I wax poetic about this stuff, y'all, so forgive me. These particular artists, this is a group of 26 artists altogether that come out of Florida. They operated primarily through the 50s through the 1980s, painting Florida's landscapes beautifully as they saw them. Sometimes they might sell their stuff hustling on the side of the highway. We see folks selling roses and stuff now. You might have seen some folks out there selling these paintings. As such, they became known as the Florida Highwaymen. And one woman, there was one woman in there as well. So as you can see, just really stunning, stunning work. And just the idea that folks who had to work for a living, these are not folks that went to art school. They did not go to SAIC or anything like that. Many of these artists are self-trained. And after going to work and raising their families or doing whatever, took the time, made the time to make this kind of art. So back in the day when they were probably just kind of hustling by the road, you could have gotten one of those paintings for about maybe $25. So now, you know, they're selling at auction anywhere between $5 and $10 grand. So I tell people, if you got one of those in your garage somewhere, if those names sound familiar to you, give me a call, okay? Just let me know. Next slide, please. This next artist deals with, hang on for a second, you guys. Let me hydrate. Hang on. Because I would be one dry, crusty, creaky. So, okay, much better. This is Alma Thomas. And Alma's got grand history. One, as you see, her take on the landscape is certainly like very different. It's not the literal type landscape that we saw in the previous slides. Her approach is almost like you see a lot of squares and strokes, or it almost even has a rhythm or a ripple to it. So this is her unique style. And so what's kind of cool is that she's playing into what was really a very contemporary way of art making at that time. Some of you may have heard the term say it right, Juarez, abstract expressionism, and that came in a lot of different forms. I won't get too deep into that history. I just, have you take a note of that. But where hers was different is in that it had this sort of rhythmic pattern, this sort of repetition, and rather than just pushing paint across a canvas, she used this sort of rhythm and repetition to express her feelings about the landscape. Just a little bit of history. She's the first graduate of Howard University's art program. So, putting it out there. She taught in DC's public schools for over 35 years and then retired and started her art career and then just kind of came off and just went crazy on us. So she is part of, again, another name I'll throw out is Sam Gilliam, who we just lost not too long ago. And she and Sam Gilliam were of this sort of what they call the Washington Color School. So this sort of idea of abstract expressionism as really just playing with color and having this love affair with color and stroke. Next slide, please. Uh-oh. Ooh. Okay, next up, that's where I am. A colleague of Alma Thomas and someone who curated her exhibitions of her work is David Driscoll, another ancestor that we just lost not too long ago. This man has a stunning record as a curator, as a scholar, as a teacher, and so on. Is also probably the best thing he's known for is a landmark exhibition in 1976 called 2 Centuries of Black American Art, where he basically showed the world that African Americans were not only making valid, brilliant, vibrant art, but had been doing so since the time of enslavement in this country. So really a phenomenal body of work. I'll encourage you to check him out online. But while he was busy being all these things, and a husband and a father and a curator and all this sort of stuff, he also was an artist. Right at the time that he was at Howard, so he also went to Howard, and he was invited to attend a place called Skowhegan, the Skowhegan School of the Arts. And it was up in Maine. And you say, well, what was folks doing up there in Maine? Well, what he was doing up in Maine was falling in love with the landscape and the trees and the pines. He eventually even goes on to buy a studio there where he was constantly, that was like his retreat. So this man painted trees a lot. I'll just say a whole lot. But just beautiful and stunning, and like no two are the same. So I'll encourage you to check Driscoll out. And for nothing else, take a look at how he handles trees. And a lot of it is because this love affair that he has with nature. He's coming out of the South, out of Appalachia. So he's coming from folks who would gather their own herbs because they couldn't get to the doctor or get to the medicine. He eventually goes on to create his own gardens. He's really almost like, I think it was Monet they talk about, who has all the fabulous gardens and things like that. So Driscoll has his own fabulous gardens as well. Next slide. I'm trying my best not to linger. Another artist that has this love affair with trees, this is Richard Mayhew. Mayhew comes to us from the West Coast. He's of Native and Afro descent. And a lot of these trees he's talked about as being trees that are right near him. He's really fortunate to live like near this kind of splendor. But of course, he's putting his own colors, his own shine on them. Really just stunning work. It's like to see these pieces up close and personal and full scale is really kind of like, dare I say, life-altering. But for those of you who like to play with all the crayons in the crayon box, you might enjoy all of Mayhew's colors. Next slide, please. So we've talked quite a bit about artists who have documented the land, who've portrayed the land, who've painted the land. I'm going to show you a few who've actually done some direct intervention with the land. This piece is right here in Chicago, right on the south side. It is actually still here. It's been up for a few years. We thought they were going to take it down. It's still up. So if you're on Lakeshore Drive, just please be careful. It'll be like towards 47th Street. You can kind of see it, but like again, just being careful on the road. But this was built by a team of artists, Dorian Sylvain, Arlene Turner Crawford, and so on. They collaborated. There was part of a program in the parks to build these what were called gathering spaces. And I think there were about maybe 5 or 6 throughout the Burnham Wildlife Corridor along Lakeshore Drive. Yeah, I was psyched about that too. Yay. And so different artists did different things in different styles. These artists came together to create a piece that celebrated the idea of Sankofa. So the shorties in the house, you guys know what Sankofa means? If you're under the age of 21, do you know what Sankofa means? So she like, I don't know, and I'm not so sure I care. But anyway, Sankofa means go back and get it. Go back and fetch it. So it speaks to this idea of remembrance. Some of you may have heard there's a more southern version that says you can't tell where you're going if you don't know where you've been. That's very much the essence of Sankofa. So this idea that a people who doesn't know their history is essentially lost. They have no guidepost for where they're going to go. So this is actually shaped, the traditional Sankofa, which comes out of, I believe, a Khan symbolism. Forgive me for my African reference being off. But it was typically rendered as a bird that's walking forward while looking backwards over his shoulder. And oftentimes he's carrying, you can see in the close-up here, he's got a little seed in his mouth. So that's like the seed of potential, seed of the future. And this one was pretty well decked out. It's really a very huge piece. It's humongous. And so they was all decked out with Adinkra symbols and mosaics and things. Next slide. And so on the other side, that the Sankofa is really doing its thing about the Sankofa. What you've got here are images and QR codes about aspects of Chicago's history and Chicago's heroes and sheroes, down from Margaret Burroughs to Jack Johnson. If they're not Chicagoans, they've certainly passed through here. There's Emmett Till. There's a little clip of the Wall of Respect, Gwendolyn Brooks, Sam Cooke, John H. Johnson, Ida B. Wells. I said Sam Cooke. The Southside Community Arts Center, Nat King Cole, Bessie Coleman. So lots of history to be had in one piece of art. And it's designed that people can come and sit, because again, it's meant to be a gathering space. So if you get a chance, it's right off 47 and Lakeshore Drive. You got a bit of a hike to get to it, but hopefully it'll stay up another couple of summers. Again, really beautiful collaboration and intervention with the land. Next slide, please. This is by an artist named Martin Puryear. We might have a few Fisk people in the house. Puryear taught at Fisk, just as an incidental. And Puryear's kind of interesting in that his subject matter isn't typical stuff that we're used to seeing. His way of working isn't particularly figurative, and it's kind of abstract, and it's just really, but it's interesting and it's beautiful. He comes out of a background of woodworking and carpentry, so there's a lot of his work that he's made out of wood that's just, you know, Scandinavian furniture looking on steroids, beautiful to look at. Even if you don't really understand just what it is he's trying to make, he makes it really beautiful. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around him. But he also does these, in addition to public art pieces, he does these like land interventions. We call this like either land art or environmental art, where they just go in and dig up some land. You guys like digging in the land? You like digging in sand, playing in the dirt? You guys like playing in the dirt, playing in the mud? Yes? No? Hey, woman after my own heart. Well, this guy does too. And he did it on a really grand scale. So this piece, Bodark Art, this is actually housed at the Manilow Sculpture Garden out at, which school was it, Prairie State or Governor State? I think it's Prairie State. Forgive me on that one. Next slide. But this next shot, you'll get to see the entire piece. This is just the chair at the portal. The chair that you just saw is actually all the way at the back to the trees. So you can see that the whole piece takes the shape of a bow. So he's rendering this idea of like a Native American bow. You can enter through that portal, come all the way down, and then have a seat and look from the other end. So it's really a different way of approaching art. It's, you know, and rather than just putting something on the wall for you to look at, here's something that has to be contemplated, perhaps walked through or sat through or something like that. So work on a vastly different scale. Next slide. All right, so here we have a few artists that want to warn us, because part of what we saw, like in the work of Marvin Gaye, is this idea that we need to get a handle on this environment before it's too late. Next slide. This is Wangechi Mutu. Wangechi comes to us out of Kenya and is an absolutely phenomenal collage artist. I'll encourage you to give her a Google, check her out. And through the years, she's also been experimenting with film and video. And this particular piece, she's collaborating with a performer named Santigold. And basically, Santigold turns into this huge monster that eats up all the birds. It's kind of spooky. But she's often interested in these ideas of waste, overconsumption, overfeeding, and so on. So it's up on YouTube. I'll encourage you to give her a look-see. Next slide. This is another Chicago artist. This is Candace Hunter, otherwise known as Clee. Among a number of projects that she's done, this one is probably her environmental opus. It's called Dust in Their Veins, and it deals with the global water crisis as it pertains particularly to third world women. She's bringing this idea. Anybody thirsty? If anyone's thirsty, there's water right there on the table. And as you drink that water, you can kind of contemplate how blessed it is to have water right in easy reach. When you went to the bathroom, you were able to wash your hands and the water was even heated. Part of the problem that Candace Hunter is pulling in this particular work is this idea of women who have to go for miles and miles to get water. We see these really prosaic images of women with water jugs on their head. We always see that in African art. That really looks so cool. But when you consider the fact that many women may have to walk as many as 10 miles to get water with that jug on their head, then, you know, you start thinking about the medical problems that come with it and so on. Also ideas of corporations that are, you know, buying out water rights and so on. But again, a larger idea, she has these forms, these torsos are kind of central to the work. And she's talking about this idea that oftentimes the women that are involved in this don't have voices and don't have mobility. They're kind of stuck in these systems of having to, you know, perpetually fetch water. Again, if you make it a 10-mile hike to get water, it's kind of hard to get to school. It's hard to do these other things in your life. So it's something that she points out in her work. A lot of her work is very heavily activist in nature, so I'll encourage you to check her out. Next slide. Next up is another Chicagoan, kind of favoring Chicago's very own here. This is Tonika Johnson, and she's getting quite a bit of attention these days. Probably one that's really put her on the map, so to speak, is this piece called the Folded Map Project. And what she did is she started looking at the disparity in neighborhoods and communities at addresses that were similar except by north or south. So I think up here we have 6900 South Ashland, 6925 North Ashland. And she was able to go through and highlight the differences in the community, the lack of green space and access. She even went so far as to invite people from these opposing addresses, if you will, to come together and meet and just kind of create a bit of understanding and community dialogue. So really a very interesting project, highlighting this sort of, I guess, what I would call a social environment. So she's getting a lot of press now, and there's more information about her on WTTW because she's getting that kind of press. Next slide. Afro Sheen Blue and Harold's Fried Chicken Red. Those are some of the colors that this artist used to paint the houses. What she did is she actually sought out abandoned houses on the south and west side of the city, and late at night when nobody was looking, she found a body of colors that she worked with and just kind of went out and painted them. So it wasn't so much to make the houses look better, so to speak, though she had a nice little color palette. I think there was Crown Royal Purple, Pink Hair Moisturizer Pink, and a couple of other colors that are kind of specific to African American social norms, customs, stuff we put in our hair and stuff. But it was also to underscore this sort of, demolition of housing stock during a time when affordable housing is really kind of at less than peak, so to speak. And so she does a number of these projects because, let me back it up a bit. She's an architect by training. So not only is she a painter, but she's also an architect. And she uses sort of her platform as an architect to underscore these issues of racism and lack of access vis-a-vis housing. So a very interesting project. Again, another one that got her on the map. Next up, next slide, please. Went back, okay. This is Preston Jackson. If you drove along the north side of Lakeshore Drive a few years back, you may have seen this piece. Preston comes to us out of Peoria. He was a teacher at the School of the Art Institute for a number of years. He's a metal sculptor. If you're down in Peoria, he has a wonderful installation called Bronzeville to Harlem that's up right now, so shameless plug. But this piece here, his sperm whale, what he ends up doing, you don't see it quite here, is he actually fills this piece up with plastic bottles, so those same plastic bottles that we're drinking our water but also underscoring the problems that come when we litter our seas, when we go out and we dump those bottles and we don't really care where they end up. A lot of times they end up in marine animals and marine life, and if you don't want to swallow one, we know we don't want orca to swallow it either. So through his particular activism, it was a little something that you can see in action every time you made it down Lakeshore Drive. Next slide. Now the guys I've just shown you sort of slide right into this category where I talk about, Audre Lorde uses this term, the personal is political. So oftentimes things that might affect us personally become the beginnings or the root of political action. Next slide. And let's see, should be one before that, thank you. And a few things are becoming more political these days in access to water. You guys know that of the problems that have been going on in Flint, those problems are still going on in Flint and parts of Michigan. Even though we don't hear about it in the news, the Ukrainians and all those things get a lot of attention right now, and rightfully so. However, these kinds of issues have faded from public view, and they're still struggling with these things. One artist, William Popel, had kind of a humorous but yet poignant kind of way of going about it. As a fundraiser, he bottled up Flint water, tap water. So you can buy this beautifully labeled bottle of Flint tap water. In fact, you could buy it by the case. He set up these pop-up shops where you could buy cases of this undrinkable water. So you kind of, as a viewer, or as a, I guess, consumer, but you can't really consume it because they say on the bottle, you can't drink this. Okay, so this idea of buying bottled water that's poisonous to help support this community that's been poisoned, I can almost write a slam poem out of that. But again, an interesting way of raising both money and awareness. So this is William Popel. Now I'll give you a moment. So I think you can still buy it. There have been different installations around museums and things like that, but just don't drink it. Next slide, please. Another artist that has been working on the crisis in Flint is a woman named LaToya Ruby Frazier. You can check her out. She has a really marvelous TED Talk that I'll just summarize in really teeny-weeny bits here. She did an exhibition, and, you know, she's at that level of artist where, you know, people pay her good money to show her work, because she's good. She's a really brilliant photographer. And so what she did is, rather than pocket the money and go home like sometimes I might do, she turned her money back over to Flint. She actually contributed that money that she earned into buying this machine that actually purified and reworked the water so that citizens of Flint were actually able to put their bottles up and get fresh, clean water. So a whole difference. Here's an artist that's really putting their money where their mouth is. Makes you wonder what all them basketball players are doing. Next slide, please. I'm just saying. Okay, here on the south side, you've probably heard of the Stony Island Arts Bank, and if so, you've probably heard of one of the masterminds behind it, a young man named Theaster Gates. And his resume is really, really long, so I won't get into the whole details here. But an interesting thing that he did, he took this dilapidated bank on 67th and Stony Island that was basically falling into ruin and disrepair, and he raised the money. He bought it from Rahm Emanuel for $1, with the condition that he renovated. So it's like, okay, I got this big old raggedy bank for $1, but how am I going to, get it together, get the ceiling from falling? Well, he did something really clever. What you see here, these are the marble tiles that used to be in the bathroom of the bank. So he had them removed, and he had them engraved, and I think he sold them, for like maybe $5,000 a piece, something like that. And he sold a whole bunch of them. And in the course of doing that, because, you got artists that can invest like that. There are people out there that got that kind of money. Yeah, let me get an engraved bathroom tile. And it's got his signature on it and everything. So it probably will appreciate in value. But that's how he raised the money to renovate this bank. Next slide. And a beautiful job he's done. He's kind of willfully, intentionally left some spaces maybe looking a little flaggedy-raggedy, but the spaces that he's really worked on are stunning. There's a listening room. There's like a library there, an archive from the Johnson Publishing Library. He's got the Frankie Knuckles collection there now, and you can go in and actually listen to, we've talked about those records, those black things that people listened to music on back in the day. So they have those there. In addition to a vast slate of programming, exhibitions, all kinds of things that's going on. And through his Rebuild Foundation, he's actually striving to create jobs and trying to create opportunities for people, tradespeople, craftspeople, as well as artists. Whew. I need to talk faster because I can just go on all night. Next slide, please. Other artists investing in the community. Emmanuel Pratt is one of a number of thinkers, creatives that are throwing their energy behind this sort of community rejuvenation. The Sweetwater Foundation, as you can see, they plant stuff, they grow stuff, but they're also working with local youth. Next slide, please. One. There we go. To teach them really like urban farming, this idea that, we sort of lost sight of how to grow our own food, how to take care of ourselves, how do we sort of repopulate these food deserts so that we have access to something that's not going to kill us before our time. Hear that, McDonald's? But, so he's throwing a lot of energy in that. So oftentimes, the things that these young people grow, they sell them, in some cases give them away, selling them to restaurants and things like that. So they're not only learning the land, but also learning entrepreneurship and really kind of learning a skill that really is becoming more and more vital these days. There's several others, Earl's Garden, May's Kitchen, the Breathing Room Gardens, the First Nations Gardens, Semelias de Justicia, that are doing these same sort of things. Sweetwater is probably among the biggest, farthest reaching. Next up. All right, there are some people that deal with, our environmental scenario by taking stuff that normally would end up in landfills, like these lovely bottles here, and actually making art out of them. Next slide. This is Mr. Imagination, Gregory Womack, And I believe he originally comes to us out of Philadelphia, but he had a very long sojourn here in Chicago. He was probably the most inventive user of a bottle cap that you can find anywhere. So you can see here, he's even wearing them. They're emblazed on his sculpture, on his throne, on his scepter, on his crown, on his jacket. He could just, really kind of make anything out of anything. But those bottle caps were almost like one of his signatures. Next slide. So of his many commissions were the House of Blues franchise. He's done one in Chicago. So if you go to the one in Chicago over near Marina City, you can see how the bars and the bathrooms are all done with all these bottle caps and things. And then this one in Orlando, he went even further. You can kind of see there like old Hot Wheels cars and junk jewelry and all this sort of stuff. So it's similar to the idea if you look at the Watts Towers, where he's taken these structures and built up on them and then taking all this stuff that we normally throw away and create something, definitely interesting. You can certainly say it's interesting. Next slide, please. Another artist doing some interesting things here is Garland Martin Taylor. He's been working with guns and bullets, if you will. You may have seen in the news he did this really humongous gun, and he traveled around the city with it. He actually traveled around the country with it. And in the gun were molded faces of victims of gun violence, and he had the names of the victims all emblazoned on the gun. So needless to say, brother traveling through the city with a gun is already problematic when it's a big, 8-foot thing you can even imagine. But he's doing, on a smaller scale, interesting things even with bullets. So he's trying to tie in this connection between gun violence, access to ammo, access to drugs and things. So over here on the right is actually like a bubblegum machine but instead of, gumballs and Pokemons and stuff, you get these like funky bullets. So he's doing these interesting things, again, sort of treating the bullet as an art piece in and of itself, but also making a certain amount of political commentary. So you say, what's that got to do with the environment, Juarez? Well, I'm going to call it the social environment there. Next slide. But also we talked about creative reuse. This is Alan Emerson Hicks, who has some very interesting ideas about what to do with all this stuff. So he often not only makes these creations, so like this really well-emblazoned fast food, what we call the snack dress. You've had the cocktail dress, now you have the snack dress. But also he's often done performances, and not so much in a dress necessarily, but different pieces that he's created. So you can see the hat up there are like either lids or rings that come off our pop bottles, and then, some of y'all know a few of them snacks there. You might know a few of them. Next slide, please. And so, if you're the carnival maiden, you have to make your entrance upon the carnival horse. So this also gives you a sense of the scale that he works at. This is like something you can actually ride on and real colorful. I'm almost done, Boobie. They've been really good and patient. I have to give it to them because I know I go on. Next slide, please. Has anybody gotten that pile of grocery store bags? I have one in my car that I can't seem to get rid of. I'm trying to find some place to dump them rather than just throwing them away. And Sydney Lewis is an artist who was of a mindset where she said, well, throw away, don't go away. She actually created something called Talga. And that idea that this stuff ends up in a landfill, it doesn't biodegrade, we're just kind of stuck with it forever and ever. And she started making art out of it. So here you've got this piece that's made out of paper towel bags. You know how they bag the toilet paper and then put another big old wrapper around it. She's done some sort of heat treatment to get them to press in. So you can recognize there's the Bounty, of above is Scott, so you know what brands I use. But again, this idea of creating something interesting, possibly useful, as a way of keeping all this plastic out of the landfill. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's one. So not only did she make flat art, but also jewelry. So actually pieces that could be worn that are really fairly lightweight and rather charming. Next slide. Ladies, you got those shoes in the back of your closet that you know you're not going to wear, but you know you just don't have the heart to throw them away. Here's someone named Willie Cole. I'm not going to say he's a foot fetishist, but he does an awful lot of things with shoes. The piece on the left is called Made in the Philippines. It's a really sly reference to Imelda Marcos, who was head of the regime in in the Philippines, because she was known for kind of, excessive spending in a country that was really like struggling. And she was known for having all these shoes. So Made in the Philippines. And then this one is a play on Soul Brother. If you look really closely, you can see like the face that's in there. So all out of shoes, really just very, very clever. Next up, please. This artist is getting a lot of press, a lot of attention. This is Nick Cave, and he's known for these sound suits, known because they make music. He also does performance work with them, and he can collect just about anything. There are films about him online where he just hits the junk stores and the flea markets, and he can make a sound suit out of just about anything. So not only is he, again, taking stuff that would normally end up in a landfill somewhere, but he's also interested in this idea from the performance standpoint of doing work that makes people happy. He'll go out in the audience and dance with people wearing these suits, or he trains these troops of performers that go out and do all these like wild, funky things as a way to get people to loosen up and be a little happier and find a little bit of joy in life. Next slide. Ooh, wait a minute. Okay, ain't too bad here. All right, next slide. This is Shakaya Booker. She's had several pieces installed here in Chicago, and most of her work is made with tires, those steel-belted radios that are on your car. How she cuts them and welds them and pieces them together is a mystery to me. The only thing I can vouch for is sister got some real rough hands. I met her once. But really incredible, compositions made from these, again, what would normally be industrial waste. Where do all those tires go after, we get them off our car? Next slide, please. So here's another one. Again, I'm always amazed at how she even cuts these things into ribbon, and she won't tell anybody. But she is making that point that it is so hard to be green. If you can imagine the labor that goes into building something on that scale. But again, artists trying to keep the junk out the landfill. Next slide. All right, so my final segment, I know because y'all been patient, is just a little bit about this idea of the Afrofuture, if you will. This idea, you're hearing Afrofuturism thrown out a lot. Even Octavia Butler's work is now on Hulu, which I'm like, okay, we're arriving. But this idea of black people imagining a better world for themselves, and this idea of it sort of colliding with these ideas of science fiction to say, well, why should the sci-fi artists have all the fun? Maybe we might do well in space too. We might create our own little Harlem or something like that. It could be a very interesting idea. Next slide. We see a lot of it both in art and in music. Let me see. Okay. I'll trust you on that one. Yes, I did. I put that there. This is Kerry James Marshall. He's got a really amazing piece over on the side of the Chicago Culture Center downtown honoring great Chicago women. Had a fabulous show here not too long ago. But here, again, really Afrofuturism at its finest. You've got the black family, in their sort of Jetsons era home and the Milky Way off in the background, but yet they're still holding on to their cultural artifacts, even though the children are now learning off of, computer vision or whatever that's coming out of the dining room table. So this interesting idea of both the old and the new kind of colliding, but that idea of the need to keep the culture going no matter what technological advances that we experience. Next slide. And some of you might remember Sun Ra, Space is the Place, these really futuristic otherworld types of performances that, again, were really, he probably wasn't calling himself an Afrofuturist back then, but he certainly was exploring that idea of, well, what would happen if we traveled there or lived there? Next up. So one might say he's sort of the creative grandfather of this guy here, who was, what you recognize, there's the landing of the mothership connection. So he created this whole cult of the mothership connection and landing and the advent of the P-Funk. There's really a whole story behind it, and I won't get into the whole details there. But again, creating music and creating this whole like persona and this idea and stage presence of this idea of black people populating these other worlds and creating these otherworldly sounds. And some of us have danced to George Clinton, so we already know those otherworldly sounds. Next slide, please. An artist who really should have been getting her flowers long ago is Octavia Butler. If you've seen Kindred on Hulu these days, the series ain't really doing the book justice, and that's her earlier work. She has produced incredible, really large resume of work. Among her last two works were Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. And if you ever wanted something that would presage the current right-wing administration, the advent of Trump, check out Parable of the Talents. And she wrote that probably back in the mid-90s. Really spooky, but incredibly prescient work. And at the root of it all, at that particular storyline, was a woman who wanted to create a new world order. You've heard the term, I'm not artsy, I'm forgetting what it's called. But as they're going through this crazy administration and fighting for survival, she's writing these books of a new world order, a new way of thinking, a new thought. The things this woman was capable of that came up in her work are just like mind-blowing. There's a whole series of these beings that wanted to colonize Mars, and so there were black people that were selected to be part of that colony. Just an amazing body of work. I can't even get into all of it here. Shapeshifters, people that can inhabit your soul and move from one soul to the next. But really an incredible, brilliant mind that we lost way too soon. Octavia Butler. Next slide, please. So I won't gush too long. Our last contemporary piece, this was a recent installation by a woman named Fo Wilson. This was at the Hyde Park Art Center. And she created a space called Dark Matter. And so she created these like orbs, sort of celestial orbs. You'd actually walk into this space. There's this huge sculpture hanging from the ceiling. And then she created all this like soundscape stuff with like moon sounds and things. And the vibe was to create a space for meditation where people could actually envision a better future or a better Afro future. So she actually had pillows in the space, and I took my students in to go and meditate, and that was their response. They said, yeah. Because I actually had students that had never meditated before, that had reached the ripe old age of 19 and 20 and had never taken the time to still their mind or to envision anything better than where they were. So I feel very validated that there was a space that I could take them to. And then last slide, because I have rambled on and on and on. I'm going to end with another Robert S. Duncanson one, just again so you can get that Hudson River School, just beautiful sky on sky on sky. And I'm not sure there are even any people in this one. But that idea of looking to the rainbow, keeping a sense of hope, and so that idea that we can survive, not only we as a planet, but we as African Americans, because we've been through some stuff historically, and we too will rise above the current crises. We just keep a little bit of hope. And so that's it for me. I thank you very much for hanging out with me this evening. You've been great. I took all the time. But if there are any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for taking us through the historical look of what people of African descent have done with the environment is really great. So I appreciate that. You made my evening. My question to you, let me do the other one. I'm on the board of Sweetwater Foundation. I'm the global ambassador for Sweetwater, so this was an amazing treat, and I can't wait to tell our team that you did this, so thank you for that. Invite everybody to be involved with Sweetwater Foundation. Does your own work involve dealing with issues of the environment, or futuristic stuff or cultural stuff? The broad brush.
I probably, I've had some print work and I've been accused of being Afrofuturist. One vein that I've been playing with is the idea of cyber res, this idea that we're getting so married, we're so close to our technology, we carry it everywhere, so why not just embed it in our foreheads and stuff? So I have addressed a number of images about that. And then the idea that what's that mean to be a black woman that's half cyborg? We haven't seen any yet, you know. I mean, you know, Roddenberry had his, but, you know, what I could be a black Borg, you know, or whatever. So I'm wondering about that. A lot of my other work probably digs more into the past. I'm very interested in ancestry and sort of like work that looks like it's been dug up and digging up stories and stuff. So I'll be headed to Mexico actually this summer to go dig up some stories.
Nice. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good evening, and thank you for having us, and thank you for the very informative slides. What brought me out and what intrigued me to sign up for this lecture was the fact of African Americans. We're often dumped on, you know. The southeast side of Chicago, heavily polluted, and the environment. How I petition, I write letters to the governor, I write to the state reps, to my local officials to just clean up the area. When we're driving along, we see so much debris and garbage, and it's like no one cares. And my answer was, well, do you want to be on the committee? I said, yeah, I'll be on it. And the issue is, how do we get the funding that we know we pay through our taxes to clean our environment? And we're getting all this billions of dollars for infrastructure coming. Let me take my mask off. Infrastructure is coming. You know, that bill was passed where we can fix up roads and bridges and all. But the trash, it's bad for the psyche. It's bad for the kids. It's bad for our elderly. I think we deserve better. And I've written as much in my letters and how poisonous this is to the community and to the kids. Other than writing, I remember when I was growing up, they had the Indian with the tear drop coming down like, don't litter and all that kind of stuff. What can we do to raise the consciousness of people in general, but our public officials that we pay taxes to clean up, just to clean up our everyday streets, parks, common ways? And this is my concern. Thank you.
I'm open. I'm open to the floor. One thing, and I'm not going to even claim to have all the answers, because the southeast side, you know, it's heartbreaking when we think about, like, and it came up recently because they're trying to put artwork like in Beaubien Woods, and I'm like, well, it's a nice piece of public art, it's beautiful, but what about them Superfund sites? What about these toxic waste sites? You know, one thing I guess to take heart is like Little Village has gotten a little bit of success and sort of, you know, pushing at the mayor and things like that. It's, you know, fortunately that there is a grassroots effort to at least put it out there. I can't begin to pretend that I've got like solutions and things like that, but I'm more than happy to speak on stuff and go, you know, work around town, you know, to raise awareness. Some of it is, I mean, making use of social media too, to let people know, and sort of, especially right now, it's a mayoral election. So now's probably a good time, because, you know, Lori Lightfoot is all in my face right now, want me to, you know, donate to her campaign to pay for her next commercial and all that stuff. So at the very least, now probably is the best time than ever to at least start putting the screws to that issue. To like just making a lot of noise, even at the, I don't know how much we could get away with at the polls. at the polling places, whether you can politic there. But I'm open to the idea. So, I mean, we're in a consortium full of people. Part of the initial thing is like, they talk about Pullman and how beautiful it is, it's all renovated. Well, the Pullman company dumped a lot of their stuff on the southeast side, along with other companies, paint companies and so on like that. So what you've got here are, not only what she's talking about, just the external superficial garbage that you see, out there, but also underneath the ground. And, these are effects that affect our children long term in terms of breathing problems and who knows what. You can't grow anything on this land. So, and that's why we hear all this like controversy about General Iron want to come to the southeast side. No, we got enough problems to deal with in the south. So I open the floor to folks who might have ideas, at least things to try. Again, my thing is like making a whole lot of noise right here at election time.
One more question.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's my sister. We both share that same concern. And one thing that we did, people, I'm a type of person, I don't want to just talk about it, I try to be about it. So we recently participated in a campaign where they had a cleanup. And we actually got out there, and it seemed so much easier than what it was to actually get out there and do it. And we had the grabbers and the pick sticks and we each took, I guess we both did about maybe along the 159th Street corridor across from River Oaks. We were worn out. I guess we both did about maybe 200 or 300 feet. We both took a side of the street in the rain. And it was really tiring to actually, pick this paper up, and it's flown up under branches, and we found some of everything. And, we had the supplies to make it as best we could, to bag it, and we were helping that nature center out there. But they only had it for one day. And I guess it's last year, we've driven through there, and it seemed like it's holding, because one thing I find about people in litter, once they see an area is clean, they kind of pull back from trashing it again for a while. But once, I don't know how long that holds, but it seems like once something is clean, the general public kind of notices that, and they try to keep it clean for a minute. And I'm just remembering as a kid, I remember our father even, he would really scold us about general litter. He would prefer if you kept it in his car. Don't throw that on the ground, put it in the car, we'll get it later. And then his car was full of trash. But I remember that, and it just seems like something has changed with that. It just seems like it's vogue to throw stuff out. And all kind of trash. Dirty diapers even. And I'm like, you used to hear, well, we're not cleaning yet because the winter is bad, once spring breaks. But we've had some mild winters. So it's like it's a psychological, in-your-face type, devil-may-care type attitude that's taken over. I don't know how to pinpoint it, but like my sister said, and I feel the same way, it is depressing. You got enough to deal with, and then just riding along the street, you got just trails full of litter. And I know we can do something about that, and I'm willing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, thank you for all of us for educating us and for sharing your gifts. We can see that you're very passionate about it. It's a hard act to follow those two, but my question is thinking towards the future, and what can we do despite all of the things that we've just discussed that we know, inspire the young people pertaining to the cross connections of art and environmental and social justice? What can we do as parents? What can we do as educators to perhaps help to inspire the next generation to do better, right? Because for most of us, we don't see the connection to environmental justice and all those complicated academia terms that you professors use, right? But just in terms of everyday living, what can we do for the children? Because the children are the future, which is why I brought mine today, right? And so what can we do pertaining to that?
I'll toss a few things out there, then open the floor. Some things in the home, like the sister said back there, again, you know, we're taught not to litter. It used to be TV campaigns, give a hoot, don't pollute. So caring about things like that. The idea of learning about where your food comes from. That idea, because, you know, it of course ties into the food desert idea, and you know, that idea of all this sort of cheap, salty, Frito-Lay doesn't really care about my heart stuff that we're feeding our kids. It's always heartbreaking for me to see kids eat, you know, they've got this blue juice full of corn syrup, and it's called a little hug. It's like, so we have to sort of raise awareness amongst ourselves about like what's safe to eat. You know, granted, everybody can't grow a garden and so on, but we can make a conscious decision not to feed our kids this poison. You know, and if they're selling it in your school and pumping it, like Chicago State, they had like all of their vending machines were full of Flamin' Hots. And now there are a lot of studies that are coming out about the damage of all this pepper on young systems and bodies, you know, kind of jacked up. You know, if the sugar wasn't bad enough, all those bub daddies and things like that. So some of it is educating ourselves. Doesn't mean you have to become vegan and nothing like that, but at least that idea of being aware that, you know, sort of that salt, sugar, excessive fat triad that's being fed to us through fast food and fast food places. There's a woman online, I think she's called the Food Babe, and she's on Instagram, and she lists like the ingredient panels of all the different stuff that, you know, I'm like, okay, just from her alone, there's certain things I don't eat anymore because of the dyes and the, you know, other assorted crap. So that sort of thing. And again, it's a challenge because everybody can't afford to grow organic and that. But at least having that awareness there, okay, if I got to buy my lettuce at Jewel, at least I'm not going to feed my kid these little hugs and this food dye and all that sort of stuff. There are different groups that are operating through the Chicago Park District, the Young Cultural Stewards. They've been kind of geared over the past several years of doing pop-up workshops that are geared for teaching young children about working with recycled materials, issues of environmental justice, and so on like that. So they're based at several different parks. So the Park District website, they go from ages 5 to like 15. And should be starting up again this summer. So if you check on the Park District website, you can sign up for the Young Cultural Stewards Camp. So the same way, let me remember that. But keep an eye out for when those camps will start. I remember they don't necessarily have a sign up, but they operate like through the summer camp program at Thule Park, at Palmer Park. There's one more camp, but they also will have their like assorted pop-ups just in neighborhood parks. So I worked with them for probably about 7 years. Again, just trying to teach kids like we can do all these other things to keep stuff out of landfills. The Chicago Public Library has a lot of good resources for educators, and down at Woodson, they're hungry for you to come on through. You know, if you come through and tell the women in the children's library that you're a teacher and you need this education, they'll send a lot of books your way. You'll walk home with a bag of resources and ideas. So some of it, I mean, that's at least an initial start. Again, you know, bringing them up in the home to sort of see better ways to eat, better ways to breathe, and all this stuff. Don't believe the Pepsi Cola hype, you know. Yes, sir.
In terms of the resources in the city too, again, I'm just going to be transparent with this, plugging Sweetwater Foundation. We do have some programs in schools. We work with Beasley School, and for example, this coming week, they'll talk to the students there, and it's so amazing because once the students get involved in that, they go home and tell the parents, you know, this is important for us to eat, this is, you know, dangerous for us to eat. So they bring that message too. The other thing, again, last plug for Sweetwater, I'm very passionate about it. It's urban farm. In the summer, you can get crops there, you can get food, you can get greens. It's an urban garden, free community garden. So there's so many resources in the city, and not just Sweetwater, but other ones. So availing ourselves of those resources and then letting the schools know about that too so that they're aware of it. What you want for your children, we got to tell the schools that's what we want for them. So, yeah, thank you.
Guys, we do have to wrap there. I want to thank you guys again for joining us tonight and thank Juarez for kicking off our 2023 lecture series. We will be picking this back up in April with monthly lectures that explore nature and the environment at the intersection of art, culture, wellness, and science. So it's been a real treat to have Juarez start to satisfy that art component, but we would love you guys to continue to join us in this effort. I think that it'll be something really, really special. And again, it's always a pleasure to work with Juarez and have her here at the conservatory. And thank you guys for being a wonderful audience and guests of the conservatory.